wait a few more seconds to allow people to populate. But we're
Thanks, Susan, for doing this. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm sure it'll be pretty interesting.
Me
All
too.
right, you all are live.
okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. We have a great program for you this evening featuring retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, talking about his new book, Here, Right Matters, with journalist Susan Glasser. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat column will not be working for comments this evening, but you will be able to find there a link for purchasing copies of Here Right Matters. No doubt many, if not all of you, recall Alex from his testimony at the 2019 congressional hearings on the impeachment of Donald Trump. As a member of the National Security Council staff and an expert on Russia and Eastern Europe, Alex had listened to Trump's now famous call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and recounted how Trump had requested Ukraine investigate Joe Biden's son Hunter in exchange for US military assistance. That testimony cost Alex his NSC staff job, and a promised promotion to full colonel was effectively blocked, after which Alex retired from the Army. His military service before joining the National Security Council staff included tours in South Korea, Germany, and Iraq, where he was injured by a roadside bomb. He also worked as a foreign area officer specializing in Eurasia and as a specialist for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In his new book, Alex tells the story of his life and its defining moments. He delves into the fateful Trump phone call and its aftermath, describing how individuals in the Pentagon and at the White House did nothing as he came under attack as a traitor. As Alex indicates by his title, he seeks to reassure that in our country, right does matter, and in the end, good prevails over bad. As a Washington Post reviewer noted, while Alex himself reminds us of what genuine patriotism can look like, his fate doesn't exactly inspire much confidence in the state of our democracy. As I mentioned at the outset, Alex will be in conversation with Susan Glasser, who writes a weekly column on life in Washington for The New Yorker, and also appears on CNN as a global affairs analyst. Previously, she served as a top editor at Politico, Foreign Policy, and The Washington Post. And she and her journalist husband, Peter Baker, spent a tour in Moscow as co-bureau chiefs in the early 2000s. Out of that joint experience, they co-authored a great book about the early years of Vladimir Putin's rule of Russia. And last fall, they came out with an excellent authoritative biography of former power broker James Baker, called The Man Who Ran Washington. So Alex and Susan, screen is yours.
Well, Brad, thank you so much for giving us this chance to talk today. And I have to say, Alex, congratulations on the book. I'm sure it's not something you ever thought you'd write, but I'm also really delighted to have the chance to talk with you both about the book and about your really extraordinary experiences over the last few years. And I'm glad that Brad started by putting this in the context of Russia and the former Soviet Union. Your expertise is not the kind of expertise that comes from books, just as your experience with impeachment is not the kind of expertise that comes from books, but from firsthand experience. I think your story as that of an immigrant from the former Soviet Union is one that really shapes and molds both this memoir and your own perspective that seems to have really resonated with people. So why don't we just jump in and start on that? Although tell us where you're talking to us from. The book has taken you on a whirlwind book tour, and I see you're in some kind of hotel room somewhere. Where are you in your travels?
Sure. So thanks to Brad for both this opportunity to talk on Politics and Prose platform, and for that excellent introduction, and for you, Susan, for this, what will surely be a delightful conversation. I'm talking to you from just outside that window. It's being washed out is the beach off of, I guess, Malibu or Santa Monica. I don't know my terrain here, but it's a change of venue, because about an hour ago I was in Arnold Schwarzenegger's offices, and I was sitting in his Austria room, which was pretty awesome. It looked like I was basically somewhere in a little cabin in Austria. So yeah.
Well, I guess you probably never expected that this journey would take you not only to impeachment, but to Arnold Schwarzenegger's secret Austrian hideout. So
Yes.
book tours are wonderful things. And it's good that you're getting to do some of it in person. We found putting a book out last year that we did basically every single thing on Zoom from our house. So lucky you. I just finished the book this afternoon, and I have to say, I was just fascinated by your kind of stubborn insistence, as Brad alluded to, that the system had worked here and that fundamentally it had done its job. I want to push you on that a little bit more. Why do you feel that way? I mean, this is a president who was not only impeached once, but then impeached all over again. There's a lot of people who believe that Donald Trump, in fact, emerged from the experience of the Ukraine impeachment, emboldened in some ways that actually shaped and informed the subsequent disastrous events of 2020. I'm wondering, do you agree with that? Is it possible you can think that both things are true?
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And I do think both things are true in this case. I think, frankly, the president was emboldened. He was basically granted a writ to act with impunity going into a disastrous, catastrophic mismanagement of COVID. That, frankly, if right mattered in all circumstances universally, he would have been out of office for what is apparent to anybody that really kind of looks at the merits as an abuse of power. And then it would have been Mike Pence in that seat that would have absolutely certainly have managed a COVID pandemic better, and we wouldn't have had 600,000 Americans dead. And that, to me, is almost like the biggest, most horrible outcome of all this, that we lost 600,000 Americans that didn't need to die if there was if accountability worked, if right mattered in all circumstances. And that's something that I really, frankly, can't reconcile in my mind. But at the same time, I do absolutely believe that things did work out in other circumstances the way they were designed to. On a more micro level, I made my report on the president and really got the ball rolling. So I was the first kind of person in the line that sensed something was wrong, had a visceral reaction, and reported the president's wrongdoing, with the idea of checking it within the White House, within the kind of classified space within the national security apparatus. At the same time, I did my job from the National Security Council perspective, and undertook a series of coordinations to make sure that what I thought was really kind of an abuse of power didn't have unforeseen kind of backlash, and I shared the most relevant salient points without going into gory details about everything that the president said. And I think George Kent attested to this, because I gave him he describes what I said, what I told him as kind of wave tops. And I coordinated with him and other folks in government, really two of them, George and one other individual, and they felt like this issue was not going to be resolved within those official channels. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. One of them is that, or one of the reasons that I have in my mind is that if Fiona Hill was still in that seat, maybe some people would have acted differently, but she was gone. She was pushed out by Tim Morrison. Kind of like a reaching type of individual that wanted to put himself in the in position that he may have, frankly, in my opinion, wasn't qualified for. And then that resulted in this some other individual reporting it to IG channels, and didn't
You're
take
talking
no,
about the CIA whistleblower.
the CIA whistleblower, and did not take no for an answer in that case, because initially a short memo was basically squashed because the CIA IG reported to the White House, and they were going to let it die there. But recognizing that this was an enormous abuse of power and a threat to our democracy, kept pushing to get it into the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and then with an obligatory requirement to report to Congress. And that's how this whole thing kind of blew up. So just to finish, because this answer is dragging out, that led to an impeachment. That impeachment did not result in the president losing his position, but that chipped away at this notion that this president, was a good chief executive, that there was good governance. And that started the kind of what I think is a snowball effect that ultimately exposed the president for who he was, and led to a really pretty significant loss, as far as I'm concerned, an incumbent president losing by 7 million votes in a popular election. And that's why I think, right mattered. The American public saw through that, saw past the political actors that were looking to, preserve their own positions and accrue power, and working past that held the president accountable. That's why I think, it's kind of worked out.
But let's talk, Alex, about that spark, that moment when you were listening to the phone call that leads to you taking this really extraordinary action of deciding that the president of the United States is doing something improper. Because you write, and it's so interesting to me, your account in the book, you write that you looked around that room, you knew instantly when you heard President Trump say, "Do us a favor though," and then raise the issue of Biden and investigations, that was, you knew instantly that crossed a line for you, that was inappropriate. But you also write in your book, and I don't think I've heard you say this before, that when you looked around that room, you knew, or you felt certain, that no one else was going to report it, and so that the duty fell upon you. Why were you so certain that no one else would do what you considered to be the right thing?
It wasn't necessarily that I thought I was certain that nobody else was going to do the right thing. I just knew that the responsibility fell on my shoulders, and I didn't ponder who else was going to be there, if I would be the outlier in the room, if other people would share my concerns. Ultimately, it turns out that Tim Morrison, while he couches it differently in his testimony, he was also concerned enough to report this matter, but he did it in a way that, a political operative would do it, and to kind of like, cover his ass, and to, indicate that he was going to play ball with the administration. In my case, I basically made it clear that this was wrong. This was a fundamental attack on the very foundations of our democracy, the peaceful and free and fair elections, and the peaceful transition of power. I saw that this was under threat, and that's what I reacted to viscerally. I was not going to abrogate my responsibilities to defend this nation, defend the Constitution, because of some sort of political calculus.
Why did you begin the book with this very dramatic scene where you go into your brother's office? He's serving as an attorney for the NSC, and you tell him the president could be impeached over this. Why did that thought occur to you?
I think it's interesting that there are certain things that are kind of associated with my actions. I guess I tend to talk pretty straight, and what I think or what I feel comes out pretty naturally, just like Here Right Matters in that kind of fateful scene testifying in front of Congress. And my breadth of experience in government, my kind of analytical background, the significance of the moment all kind of weighed in on me walking into my twin brother's office and saying, "Eugene, if what I'm about to tell you ever becomes public, the president will be impeached." And all that was is, frankly, in my mind, an assertion of the import of the moment, not a kind of a prediction that it would happen, because I actually didn't think it was going. I
You
had no
thought
idea.
that there was still a chance that you could do this extraordinary thing of reporting the president and that it wouldn't become public.
Well, it's interesting. This kind of dispels any notions of deep conspiracies that are closely held, because things, you tell two people in Washington and you tell the world, or something of that nature. This is a case in point. In my judgment, what I was doing is the same thing I had done just 2 weeks before, when Gordon Sondland, basically
The famous drug deal conversation.
the famous drug deal conversation, in which Gordon Sondland basically lays out that, working with Mick Mulvaney, that he would be able to get President Zelensky a meeting in the White House in exchange for an announcement of an investigation. And standing in front of Gordon Sondland, I was like, we're not going to do this. I was adamant that, we were not going to be party to this kind of this drug deal, this enterprise. And I basically followed through on that on the next time that it came up, except at that point, I was still, there was maybe some wishful thinking based on my reverence for the office of the president, that it wasn't the president somehow, that it was just people trying to ingratiate themselves, curry favor with the president. But when the president basically made this demand of Zelensky, there was no denying it. And I was not going to be kind of dissuaded by my reverence for the office of the president or anything of that nature, because in my conception, one of the reasons that right matters here is that nobody's above the law. Everybody is accountable.
So that's really interesting to me, actually. And reading the book, that stood out for me in a way I hadn't thought about before, that you were already aware of some of the elements, obviously, of what was happening. You knew, because it was public, about Rudy Giuliani and, the forcing out of Ambassador Yovanovitch, with whom you had worked well. You knew that there was something weird and political about that. You knew that the hold on aid, had become your all-consuming problem as a Russia policy person, and you were working on that. You knew that Gordon Sondland and others were involved in what seemed like kind of a rogue Ukraine policy. But I find it fascinating that it really wasn't until that exact moment that you're sitting in the Situation Room listening to Donald Trump on the phone with President Zelensky of Ukraine, that actually was the moment where you realized, oh, he's in on it too. And to me, that's very interesting. I mean, it recalls the sort of, in Russia, there's always this notion of the dobry czar, the good czar, and like all those evil boyars who are, screwing things up around him. It was that moment.
So, there's nothing is quite that simple. So I would say it this way. I had probably a little bit of a blind spot, because I was an Army officer, lieutenant colonel, and this was the commander in chief. And frankly, I had a deep reverence for the office of the president, even though, in fact, this man, I had a very good idea of who he was. And it's not that I put it past him in any way that he would do this. I just kind of somehow managed to, in my mind, separate and rationalize that these could be people that are doing it on the president's behalf, based on this general atmosphere of, corruption and, that I just didn't think that the president was willing to go that far, even though I had seen firsthand the president, without getting too deep into other areas that have not kind of exited the classified space. I'd seen the president be duplicitous and kind of double dealing and self-serving before, but it's different seeing that from afar, and then rather than having it fall squarely in your portfolio on your shoulders. And I think, in fact, in this case, because I was an Army officer, I had a little bit of wishful thinking that this may have not gone all the way to the top. I remember at one point at a sub PCC, a sub principals coordinating committee meeting. I'm sorry, not policy coordinating committee meeting. Somebody telling me it was the president's chief of staff that had directed this, and I just didn't put that. In a way, I was like, before I put something like that in a summary of conclusion in a documented record, I'd really want to know that it was the president. So I was like, I definitely hung it around Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff, but it's just, there's a bit of a disconnect there. It's still something that I maybe haven't kind of fully resolved in my mind. There was a stubborn refusal to believe that the president would go that low, even though I knew who he was. And I don't know if that was an oversight. Maybe I should have tried harder to kill this meeting or never propose it in the first place. But things worked out the way they did, and the president was exposed for who he was. And basically, this was what we saw unfold over the subsequent year and a half is a continuing enterprise to try to steal an election. And this was just the first public example of the president doing that. And the last one was culminating on January 6th, where the president was the driving force before an insurrection and attempted coup.
So, Alex, you kind of dance around it a little bit in the book, but it seems that you had a kind of anxiety and a fear and a realization that you might have been the source for the information that helped to trigger the whistleblower's complaint. Have you reached a conclusion about whether you were the source or the first source of the information? Obviously, there's more information in the complaint.
Yeah. So the way the whistleblower, who he or she is obviously savvy to the way bureaucracy works, wrote their whistleblower complaint, they wrote it as indicating that there are multiple sources. So I can't be sure I was the kind of source, and that's a conclusion that can't really be reached until the whistleblower, him or herself, kind of steps out and says something. And I think that's up to that person to do that. But I could say that, and I have said it now publicly, I guess, if it wasn't for me reporting this, the president would not have been impeached. I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw.
Well, it's a carefully worded version of basically saying that it's your conclusion that you were a trigger for the information in the complaint, although probably not the only source of information.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So what's the counterfactual to you? I mean, was there ever a moment where you could have stopped there, where you thought seriously about stopping, where, you think if you had, that we never would have had impeachment #1?
Where, there were probably multiple moments where I could have followed the counsel of my attorneys, maybe of my father, of my, dearest friends and family that, suggested maybe something less than kind of the full measure in not holding back on kind of factual testimony that in their conclusions may have preserved my career. Certainly in the Army's assessment, that's what they were hoping for, something that could have was maybe more ambiguous, less direct. And in offering that kind of testimony, it's possible I could have, saved my career. But in my mind, I knew I had a job to do, which was to deliver forthright, frank, firsthand factual account of what I had witnessed and what I'd experienced. And that was what I was going to do. I was not going to kind of be convinced that there was anything less to do just to save my own skin. So on the in offering my concerns to my to the White House itself behind closed doors, that was really an easy decision. I think the harder decisions were, what to do with regards to either closed door or public testimony, recognizing that in the first instance, I was putting my tenure at the White House at risk, but in offering public testimony or on the record testimony, I was putting my military career at risk and exposing my family to kind of to threats and things of that nature. And those, in certain ways, if the first one was relatively easy to kind of just do the right thing, the next steps and persevering and staying committed to what I think was the right thing, those were in certain ways probably even harder decisions.
Well, you mentioned your dad, and obviously he formed, kind of this key moment in your testimony where you are having this dialogue with him, a fellow, immigrant from the Soviet Union who grew up in a country without the things that we say we cherish here, democracy and the rule of law, and your, admonition to him that, it was going to be okay for you because your right matters. I guess like I found your account in the book to be, a much more dramatic rendering somehow in my mind when, I thought of your original statement to the committee. I guess I just didn't realize how just quite what an incredible, family scene that was. And, I could totally see it happening from my own, family and life. You're actually turned out to be in the car with your dad and your wife. And I think there was another relative in there too. It's crowded and they're screaming and yelling. And, your dad turns out to be this big Trump supporter who, really thought it was crazy for you to do this. So tell us a little bit more about that. Because you did not give us that version of it in your testimony.
Yeah, I think that I mean, there was no way to try to do that in testimony for that matter, but
No, I agree that might have gone badly, but
yeah, but it's interesting. There's actually a picture because there were a couple of these types of moments where we're at this wedding that I talk about in the book at a cousin's wedding, and we're sitting across from each other, facing each other, kind of leaning into each other, and I'm trying to explain to my dad what's about to happen without going into details or kind of divulging anything that was classified. And my wife, takes this picture because she kind of has a sense of what's going on. I don't think it's a picture that's actually been made public, but it captures the moment almost as well as the scene that I write about in the car. And really what we're discussing are, even though my dad's lived in the United States for 40 years and absolutely believes in the American dream and that this country is different, that he was in a lot of ways falling back on a deeper lived experience in the Soviet Union and a deep concern for me and the personal risks that I was taking on. And one of the things I think I frankly I don't recall if I put in the book, but he had this vision of me of marching into the president's office, into the Oval Office, and saluting sharply and saying, "President, how do we work this out?" And us coming to some sort of accommodation, and then I could continue on with my career and not put myself at risk. And it's just not something that I was in any way really considered. I also wasn't going to argue with the guy because he was 88 years old, 87, 80. Let's see, he was at that point, I had just turned, I think, 88, and I wasn't going to kind of raise his blood pressure. But and I said, Dad, I hear what you have to say, but the bottom line is I took my own counsel and did what I thought was right because I knew that this country was different. I mean, I knew that I wasn't really putting my life at risk, even though the president was trying to target me for other folks to attack. I didn't have to fear that as much. But he was right in part also in that the testimony and speaking truth to power, I did lose my military career over that. So he's a smart old guy with lots of wisdom that he shares with us, and we always consider. It's pretty awesome to have somebody like that. But we also he raised us in a way where we're independent and make our own judgments on what the right thing to do is. And I took my counsel and moved forward on what I thought was right.
So was your dad always like a big fan of Trump, and had you argued about him before?
Well, Susan, you probably know this about as well as anybody else. There is a feature of the Russian immigrant community,
Yeah.
or of any refugee community that's fleeing kind of a communist oppressive state, where the pendulum swings them in a completely opposite direction, and they swing to kind of a unhealthy brand of conservatism that we see in certain regards with regards to an absolute rejection of anything that falls into the liberal spectrum in the Cuban community, in the Venezuelan community, in the Russian community, I think in the Chinese community, in the Vietnamese community, people that have lived that experience and reject anything that smacks of the left by embracing the right. So there's that kind of automatic partisanship that he is that he kind of falls in line with. I'm sorry, we're in a hotel room. There's a phone ringing, but so there's that. But there's also, my dad did recognize that Trump was maybe somebody that could shake things up. He was not of the DC establishment. He might be able to kind of deal with the swamp, and so my dad had that kind of affinity also. And as you well know, the Russian immigrant community is subject to a particular type of propagandization because of Russian interests that own the airwaves and feed Russian language content that allows them to really see one particular perspective. What really helped my dad out is when my mom banned Fox News in the house and really kind of metered out how much Russian language TV he could watch, and he started kind of taking in a more diverse picture. That's when he started to kind of, the blinders came off. And certainly when I was under attack, he recognized that he knows who I am, and he was going to take my word over anybody else's word. And those he very quickly kind of left that camp. But it was a little bit of a journey for him.
Well, it's in a way, it's reinforcing to hear that you didn't lose your dad over this. I mean, there are many stories in the last few years of families that have really been torn apart by the growing partisan divide in the country. And now with COVID, and the sort of, families being on different sides of this vaccine divide, you see it even more. So in a way, your story, does suggest that, love and family had, at least were able to overcome it in your case.
Yeah. I don't think it's, I actually don't think it's that dissimilar. I mean, on both sides, if it's not kind of lived experience, people fall into their factions. The people that, would believe science and the fact that COVID's a threat, and the people that, read and understand facts that, this was a legitimate kind of electoral outcome, and Biden won, and it's Trump that was stealing an election. You could see where I fall out on this. And then the other side that doesn't believe it, but that's because they're consuming content that draws them into that camp. What I think would happen is, in lived experience, people that, for instance, have had to deal with COVID and have lost a loved one or somebody that's sick, I find it hard to imagine that, seeing their loved ones in a situation where COVID does become real, that divide remains. But unfortunately, or fortunately, not everybody has to kind of deal through or kind of go through this gauntlet in order to reconcile with reality. And there is no kind of really good formula to bring people to have people lift the blinders on what in fact is going on, and consuming these lies and from elites that want to advocate for a particular view because it serves their own interests, really.
So I want to get to a little bit more, unpacking a little bit more of your experience with impeachment, but we're going to do audience questions a little bit later on. And I want to just sort of give a nudge to everyone to put your questions in the Q&A in the Zoom feed, and then we'll ask your questions then. So this is just a little bit of a nudge to the audience to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A stream so that I can ask them in a few minutes. In the meantime, Alex, I want to ask, what did you learn in the exercise of writing this book? Sometimes just looking at the chronology, putting it all down, you find out things that you hadn't really realized. And, we touched on part of it, I think, on this question of like, when did you really understand that Trump himself was at the center of this? I'm wondering if there were any other revelations for you in the process of working on this book. What did you learn about the Trump White House, for example, as you thought back on, your own role in this situation, and, maybe conclusions about what was the role of other people? I mean,
Sure.
John Bolton chose not to testify. He wrote his book, which had some pretty newsworthy stuff in it, and didn't give that information to the investigators. Did that surprise you, having worked for Bolton and seeing him?
You probably could sense from reading the book that I didn't have like a deep animus for John Bolton. Actually, I kind of respected him as a professional, even if we did have divergent views on national security and foreign policy. I thought he was in certain ways relatively effective and kind of, skilled because he'd been in government for a long time. There were a couple things I frankly learned. First of all, for me, writing is a way to kind of apply order and logic to my thoughts. And I acquired a deeper understanding of what Here Right Matters was, because like I said, it was kind of like a extemporaneous proclamation that in the United States matters. And I felt that viscerally. And I understood that it had like, you have to peel back the onion and understand that on some layers it did and some layers it didn't. I also learned that right matters if we make it matter, meaning like if public servants stand up or if people stand up for what they think is right and stick and stand by their convictions, that's how we could keep this country safe and moving forward and progressing. I learned something about whistleblowers and the challenges that whistleblowers face, which are enormous. In a lot of ways, I've been very, very fortunate, even though I'm still not quite sure of what I'm going to do in my future. I have been afforded opportunities and through hard work and enormous amount of diligence to try to make things kind of line up but a lot of whistleblowers don't do that, and we undervalue the whether that's in the economic industrial space or in governance, the value of whistleblowers that are trying to do the right thing. And I guess I'll expand a little bit on this idea that there is inherent benefit, I guess, to shortcuts, unfortunately, in this world. There is an inherent benefit to people being mercenary and self-serving, like John Bolton was, like so many folks were in maybe in the Department of Defense and the Army, that look to kind of protect their own position rather than take a risk and shield an officer that's doing the right thing. And had no ability to speak out in my own defense as a uniformed officer. I just didn't have that. And that, people could progress and benefit from that. But then those people have to live with their actions, and some of them don't care. Some of them are probably okay because they've, profited it to the tune of millions of dollars in opportunities. But other people, in my case, I'm very comfortable living with the consequence of my actions, and with the fact that I think I did the right thing, and that I could look my daughter, the center of my universe, in the eye and not have to, and she could take pride in my actions. Those are things that I could live with. And oftentimes doing the right thing is its own reward, because there is no other reward that's going to fall on you for just doing the right thing. I learned those are all the various different things I think I learned from this. It's a lot.
When you were going to testify first in a closed door hearing and then in public before the House impeachment inquiry, did anybody warn you, about the sort of weaponization of information that you were going to hear from the Republicans? And what was the sort of toughest moment in that? I was interested that you said that actually you thought then Congressman Ratcliffe, who then later became Trump's Director of National Intelligence, that you thought he did the best job of almost kind of trapping you.
Yes.
What was that like?
It was mainly kind of like a thought to a worthy adversary out of while the rest of them were more ham-handed. I guess I was very, very fortunate because of all those things that I read about in the book. All those accumulated skills and experiences allowed me to, frankly, to navigate this in almost the best possible way for an absolutely unprecedented kind of like an unprecedented affair with no real guidance on how to do things. And that included an understanding of how information gets weaponized, because there's a whole doctrine around Russian information confrontation and all that kind of stuff. And I understood quite early on because the White House was ham-handed in issuing out attack points that leaked to the press instead of just sending it to their partisan media, far right media outlets and stuff like that. They send it out, and you had places like the Daily Beast publishing it and things of that nature. So I had a not entirely unsophisticated understanding of how things were going to unfold. I also retained Republican counsel that would be able to engage with their White House friends and colleagues and kind of manage, at least manage the fallout early on, and not telegraph, the fact that I was going to be completely forthright. Really, I didn't start getting attacked until my statement was run in the New York Times. So I managed it in really kind of like the best way I thought, navigating kind of these tactical pitfalls. But I also had a mantra in my mind repeatedly: don't overthink it, do the right thing in the right way, at that moment, almost transactionally, what's the right thing to do in this situation, and stringing enough of those along in order to navigate a very kind of difficult, unknowable, kind of unnavigable series of events. So you could, I mean, it was pretty complex. I didn't miss the fact that, there was no precedent for a party in the Senate voting to remove the president, and that was unlikely to happen. But I just try to keep it simple and do the right thing in the right way in that moment, and all of it kind of came together the way it did.
One thing that comes through in the book is, the Trump White House's kind of well-deserved, it seems, reputation for, kind of internal intrigue and backbiting and office politics. You mentioned in particular a couple people in the book who were your kind of bete noir, Tim Morrison, who was the successor to Fiona Hill as the senior director for Russia, and then your office mate. Do you think this was what conclusions do you draw about, was this kind of backbiting? I mean, this happens in all offices. What was particular, do you think, to the Trump White House? How did it differ? You worked on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including at the beginning of the Trump administration for, I guess, for Chairman Joe Dunford. Yep. What was the difference between those two institutions in your view?
I mean, it's night and day. I mean, I in spite of my unreserved criticism for some folks that occupy senior positions in the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army, because I think they fell short of their obligations and institutional values. It is a highly honorable institution filled by people that, like me, that believe in the Army values, that believe in institutional values, and I didn't have to be concerned about that kind of stuff. In the White House, it's the same. It's this notion of the nature of the chief executive driving the culture of the institution, and it took on the White House took on the president's persona, that he's notorious for decades, as unscrupulous, as kind of somebody that encourages infighting, somebody that doesn't pay their bills, somebody that's as much a hazard to those around him as he is to himself. And those are the people that were drawn to this administration, to that administration, the former administration. Those are the people that frankly that would swear oaths of fealty to Trump rather than the Constitution. And that's why I received the counsel that this would be the most dangerous environment I'd be entering into. So I didn't.
Yeah, that was interesting. This was advice that you got from a couple different senior military officers who'd already been detailed to the NSC before you came over there. So why did you go ahead with the job anyways?
There was probably a couple of different things. Maybe some of them. One of them at least is self-critical, and that's the fact that I had some sort of kind of hubris about the fact that I could still do some good. I could still go in spite of this to do some good and advance U.S. national security interests. I had the honor of co-authoring the National Military Strategy Russia Next and the Global Campaign Plan for Russia. So I was the best postured person to actually have an effect on Russia policy. And if it wasn't me, then who else would be there? Somebody that would be brilliant and capable, but maybe didn't have all those formative experiences that I could offer. So I thought that I could still do some good, and that's why I went there. And at the same time, I thought in my mind that, this is a Queens guy. I'm a New Yorker. I could understand how to appeal to his transactional nature and offer kind of some clarity on why we needed to take this particular policy that, that in certain ways would resonate with things that would benefit with him. And we did have the rest of government adopt a national security strategy, if you recall, that did take a much kind of tougher tone with regards to Russia, and was implementing a policy, except for the president's own personal engagement, was actually in certain ways implementing a tough line. The problem is, for the Russians, the chief executive's kind of the chief executive is the most important figure, and if the chief executive wasn't holding the Russians to account, that really undermined everything else that was going on, all the other good works. So it's a combination of different things. I mean, I hope that I had what in smaller doses what other folks in senior positions fell victim to, which is kind of Carol Leonig's I alone kind of. I'm the only person that could establish the guardrails. I didn't have that quite that level of hubris, but I probably in smaller doses did think that it could still make a difference.
Yeah,
And that's why.
Thank you, because I think that's a really important question, and I've been asking that, of a lot of officials who served in the Trump administration. And what's striking is how many people, have their own version of that, of course, and that I think is something that historians will study.
One quick point on this one. In the military, we trained, especially as infantrymen, on fallout drills, one man out. If anything happens to the commander, the executive officer stands up. So in some smaller dose, I think in my case, I was mindful of this, and I knew that there was a whole cohort of folks, cabinet level officials, senior officials that don't have that kind of military experience. It's much easier to fall victim to it. I'm maybe a little bit more critical of the military folks that served in senior positions that should have known that there were capable folks that could have stepped up if they held the line, if they actually did in fact serve as the guardrail. And I think that was a shortfall of some of the seniors that served in the Trump administration that did have that military experience.
That's a really interesting point I haven't heard others make, Alex. So we have a bunch of questions from the audience I want to get to. One final one for me related to what we're just talking about here. So 4 years, Trump, Russia, the whole thing. What, in your view, was his deal with Putin? I mean, what fundamentally, why did we have a president of the United States who was saying so many admiring things about the president of Russia?
Well, because I think frankly, Donald Trump is a wannabe dictator, and he admired and wished to emulate the folks that, in his opinion, were, the kinds of leaders that he himself wished he could be. So that's Xi Jinping, that's Vladimir Putin, that's Viktor Orban, that's Erdogan. And he had a relatively decent rapport with these individuals because he had a proclivity to that kind of executive leadership. And in the case of Putin, Putin didn't really have to work that hard. What he found in Trump is a useful idiot, to use that kind of the term of art. When you have a case officer, the human term of art, when you have a case officer that's trying to develop somebody, is that he had somebody that really kind of admired had an authoritarian bent, and he could cater to Putin could cater to Trump's interests, and also feed into something that was to Trump critically important, which is justifying Trump's election in 2016, and setting aside this notion that the Russians are the ones that truly got him elected. So it was an easy job for Putin to do that. I don't really find there's not a lot of credence, in my view, into something deeper and more nefarious like compromising materials on because they didn't need to do that. And Putin's too sophisticated to try to run Trump based on compromise, because there could be an opportunity to have massive blowback if Trump at some moment just kind of said, well, they have this information on me. How bad would that be? They didn't need to do any of that. It was easier to just manipulate Trump in other ways.
Well, it's one of the enduring mysteries for sure. So we have some great questions from the audience. Let's get through as many as we can, knowing that we have limited time. This one is from a former officer, just like you, on combat veteran, Steve Raymer, a professor emeritus at Indiana University. He asks, how did the core values of the Army inform your decision to, quote, do the right thing? Were they an outline for action, a blueprint for moving forward? He's curious, how these experiences also compare with the actual experience that you had of leading troops in combat, which is a really interesting juxtaposition.
Hey, Steve, thanks for the excellent question. One of my very dearest friends is at Indiana right now in senior service college, so you might run across him. But I think it was critical in the way I kind of managed what amounted to kind of a crisis situation. I think there was some deeper building blocks that Army values allowed me to build on, which were those that were instilled by my father about being kind of forthright, truthful, and not broaching kind of deceit. And then if those were the initial building blocks, if you read the book, you'd find out that I was probably a bit of a rascal and unfocused. And in a lot of ways, the Army and Army values helped me develop the focus. And in a way, this concept I talk about, which is building muscle memory to do the right thing. You don't walk by mistake, something that Army officers learn. You're encouraged to kind of make on-the-spot corrections. Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. We have this leadership acronym that I just laid out for you. These are things that I had rattling on in my brain as I navigated this affair, as I did in so many other kind of less momentous challenges in my career, and trying to adhere to those values. So I think I'm that's another reason why I'm grateful for my military service, is because it made me in part who I am today. And allowed me to kind of easily gauge what the right thing was, if not the right way. Because in this case, there was no blueprint for the right way. That was really falling back on everything else I had done to that point. So I appreciate the opportunity to answer this, at least in part. Very quickly, the Joint Staff was an awesome opportunity because I was very much encouraged by my senior leadership. General Wood, my immediate kind of senior supervisor, that said, keep speaking up, you have good instincts. McKenzie, General McKenzie, who's a CENTCOM commander, calling me and said, Alex, keep doing great things. You're doing everything you need to be doing. And General Dunford also being encouraging. I think those were some fascinating and terrific people I had a chance to observe and emulate. So all of that.
Alex, I'll get to another question, but that is one of the more interesting scenes in the book, especially for me as a Russia hand, when you actually have the, sort of, I don't know if we call it chutzpah, to remain in the room when there is going to be a private discussion between General Dunford and Valery Gerasimov, the Russian head of the General Staff. And you stay in the room and become, the subject of actually a discussion between the two of them, which is really something. Okay, here's a question from Sandra McElwin. She asks, explain the fallout from your testimony. What has been the most challenging and most terrifying to you personally, and how are you dealing with it?
So I would say for my family, for my wife, it's been absolutely nerve-wracking. Being the center of public attention, when impeachment is going on, and now kind of almost voluntarily doing this with a book press tour. And she's in charge of safety. I'm in charge of fun, according to my daughter. So she feels this stuff viscerally. And I tend to be, because of my training, I tend to kind of take a cool assessment and then act off of that. We had to increase our force protection, and we at one point considered moving on installation. But it's less the physical threat than the great unknown, where we, after leaving the military, where I had a great idea of where I was going to go, we entered a new kind of a brave new world in which we didn't know what was going to be happening, what was going to happen. We did this in the middle of in the early days, in the one of the most acute periods of the COVID pandemic. I basically said, I guess I could stay on in the military and ride a desk and kind of, take a paycheck, or I could break new ground and try something else. And I didn't succumb to fear and stepped out. And we've been having to live with the consequence of that, including what I alluded to earlier, which is whistleblowers get looked at skeptically. I mean, there are people that think I'm too political, even though I don't think I'm of myself as a political actor. I'm just vehemently anti-Trump because he's anti-American. But because of the fact that they don't want to be denounced by the president, they don't want to be the subject of a, tweet equivalent. They're, the think tanks that would have naturally picked me up for a senior staff position are reluctant to do so and have told me as much. They're like, we love you, you're awesome, you're exactly what we need, but type of thing. So these are the things that we're dealing with. And part of this is my own, a bit of aimlessness to determine whether I want to go into academia based on my doctorate in international affairs that I'm working on, or think tank space, or join the private sector and consulting. So, some of those are on me to figure out what I want to do now that I'm out of the military. But those are the biggest enduring challenges, I think.
So we haven't talked that much about policy tonight. Here's a question that gets at the bigger questions around Russia and what the U.S. should be doing. This is from someone who asked, what type of pressure should the U.S. and other democracies put on Vladimir Putin to eventually get Russian troops out of the Ukrainian Donbass?
I think the Ukrainian Donbass is going to be an enduring, difficult problem, mainly because Ukraine is so critical to Russia's understanding of power and a base of power to establish a Russian multipolar world. The opening quote to my prospectus, a dissertation prospectus, is a Zygmunt Brzezinski quote that says, "It shouldn't be underestimated that Russia without Ukraine is no longer a power, but with Ukraine subordinated and subordinate automatically becomes a power." So that's the conception for Russia. And therefore it's going to be a long, vexing problem, but something that's potentially surmountable in a longer time horizon, where Russia becomes a little bit more reflective on its own true standing in the world, reconciles with a sense of exceptionalism that is not tied to Soviet power and being, in a bipolar system, but really based on what Russian power is in the modern context. And it's something that I wrote about for Foreign Affairs back in last December. This idea that part of the way we get the Russians to reconcile with this is that there's concerted action by the democracies of the world to face the challenges that rising authoritarianism poses from Russia and from China. And that we share many common problems with our fellow democracies. They have solutions to some. They could offer solutions to some. We could offer solutions to others. But by coming together, and leveraging multilateralism, that I think we achieve effects vis-a-vis Russia and China and every other problem we face.
Alex, I think we're just about out of time. So this is our last question here, and it's a nice, simple one. And the question is simply this. Do you believe that there could be another coup-style insurrection in the United States in the future, having already seen this one unthinkable event actually happen?
I would say it's hard to fathom that, because Trump had almost everything minus competence on his side. He was just not particularly competent at being a dictator. But everything else, he had the executive branch, he had the Senate. At one point, he had both the House and the Senate, and he failed to do that. So it's hard to kind of fathom the risks, but in fact, we do face enormous risks. And that's in part because of the erosion to good governance caused by 4 years of Trump, and the fact that there are more competent individuals that are latching onto Trumpism and that would use the kind of the blueprints that he had, the lack of accountability, the ability to kind of mobilize and energize a really dangerous segment of society that believes less in the Constitution and believes more in a culture war, and so we do face some significant threats. I still think right matters here, especially if we shake off complacency. And my call to arms is to make right matter. But I also don't want to understate that. I want to be somewhere where I raise the kind of the alarm, but I'm not alarmist about the threats we face, because I think they're surmountable, and this country can continue persevere and prosper and take steps forward.
All right, so we'll leave it at the alarm having been raised. Alex, congratulations on the book. It's Right Here, Right Matters. And thanks again for this really fascinating conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Great moderating, Susan, and Alex, your story in your book has definitely resonated with a lot of people. It's now time, it's official. I was just checking the New York Times bestseller list, and it's out with Here, Right Matters as #2. So
Wow.
way to go.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Appreciate it.
Everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Here, Right Matters. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you.